Hello, my name is Shen Hayward, and I'm currently a doctoral student in psychology at Harvard's social psychology program, and I'm also on the executive board of the GSC's International Higher Education and Disability Student Group, as are my fellow panelists, Kevin Mintz, Daniel Paris, and Mary Billington. Today we'll be discussing the transition from understanding disability according to the traditional medical model to the social model, which is focused on human rights and social justice. I'll be describing this shift and then discussing several examples of societal implications that truly are life or death. And then I'll briefly outline the issue through the lens of scholarship in my own discipline, in psychological science, and specifically look at the ways in which the field is challenging conventional stigmatized attitudes and taking on fallacious beliefs about the inherent quality of life of people with disabilities. Following my outline, we'll be turning it over to the students, all Harvard students, who will present their own individual experiences of living with a disability, of getting an education with a disability, and the way that these two models have impacted their life. Our goal is that all of you will leave with an understanding of the way in which disability is currently being reframed, as well as the ways in which this shift impacts real-life students. So, the medical model. Throughout history and in much of today's discourse, the medical model has been the dominant lens through which disability is viewed. It holds that disability is a wholly negative experience, a pathological medical problem which deviates from the norm, and one that is located within the individual. And because it's located within the individual, the onus for overcoming and or fixing the disability is squarely placed on the person. On a human level, disabilities are seen as personal tragedies, ones that necessarily inspire pity and hopefully inspire charity. And viewed through a stigmatized lens, disability is something that should be eliminated. I would argue that this is undergirded by beliefs about an inherently inferior quality of life, something to which I will return. Now, in contrast, the social model of disability is seen as a dynamic, ongoing interaction between the individual's characteristics, such as their conditions and functional status, and the natural, built, cultural, and social environments. The social model illuminates how environments can impede or facilitate individual functioning by erecting or removing barriers to full participation, and that these barriers are often attitudinal. Importantly, in that sense, ableism, or disability discrimination, is a form of oppression in the same way as is sexism, racism, or homophobia. And we see these barriers to social inclusion in education, in our employment systems, in housing, in transportation, in social activities, so forth. Now, let me switch to making it a little bit more real and asking the question, why is this important? Why should we promote a more positive conception of disability? Basically, why does model switching matter? In general, as societal conceptions change, so too do the elements of society that grow out of our most deeply entrenched models. And we see the impact of these models play out in decisions about who receives educational resources, who receives employment incentives, who should receive the highest quality health care. And there's myriad specific examples in the research, but to illustrate, I'll present just a few that highlight the critical nature of the models that we use. The first one that you'll see up on the slide was a study that was done by some psychologists. And although emergency medical first responders are expected to be impartial providers of life-saving services, psychological research has shown that the medical care that people with disabilities receive is strongly influenced by the beliefs of its providers, and that these beliefs are often detrimental to the very lives of people with disabilities. In one study, 94% of people with high-level quadriplegia, and it was quadriplegia where in order to breathe required a ventilator, 94% said that they were glad to be alive. However, when you asked the first-line responder emergency medical professionals to imagine whether you would be happy to be alive given that you had that disability, only 18% said that they would be. Now, what's alarming is that they asked the same medical providers again whether they believed that current efforts to resuscitate people with this disability were too aggressive, and over 40% of people said yes. And further, almost a third said that beliefs about one's quality of life, about the quality of life of people with disabilities, should influence whether or not they should resuscitate. And most alarmingly, over 1/5 said that nothing should be done to save their lives. So in other words, because they think that people with this disability have a low quality of life, over 1/5 of our medical providers believe that people who had acquired high-level quadriplegia should be left to die. And briefly, a few other areas just to help us wrap our heads around it, where we see the imprint of the medical model. With regard to Down syndrome, there's a huge funding disparity between research using prenatal testing to eliminate Down syndrome and other disabilities versus funds spent on discovering ways to improve the educational and vocational outcomes of people with Down syndrome. And it's interesting because even in my generation, the question of whether one's going to receive an amniocentesis, the test before your child is born to see if they have Down syndrome, and the reason you get the test is so that if your child does have Down syndrome, you abort. And among doctors, I did a study, and among doctors and the expecting mothers, there wasn't even a question of whether that really was an option. It was so standard. And in the second case, the one of congenitally conjoined twins, standard medical practice, which espouses separation of congenitally conjoined twins, even at the possibility of killing one or both people, despite no evidence that doing so improves the quality of life of the individuals concerned. And there is evidence that people who have a conjoined twin are able to lead lives with high quality of life and be fulfilled and happy. So again, I would argue that these life or death decisions are fundamentally based on deeply entrenched views of disability as conferring a low quality of life, and that is a low potential for happiness. Now, to return to my field, psychology, psychology has also traditionally drawn from the medical model, and psychological conceptions of disability have been built upon a foundation of societal stigma. Stigma drives the research, and the practice of psychology disproportionately focuses on depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, alcoholism, other substance abuse, as opposed to how to live well. And in contrast, the social model focus, especially with the recent advent of the field of positive psychology, is a strengths-based focus. Attention is paid to constructs such as high levels of subjective well-being, high levels of resilience, and how to nourish the building of one's talents. The area of interest or area of research that I'm particularly interested in is that pertaining to spinal cord injury. And it was this body of research that first started to open the door to a shift in looking at the possibility for a high quality of life among people with disabilities. And basically the general finding was that people with spinal cord injuries were reporting a quality of life that was as high or sometimes higher than people without disabilities. And for example, a study by Roxanne Silver found that the strongest emotion for almost 60% of people who were only 3 weeks post-injury was happiness. And in the most famous study of human happiness, they found two things. First, that lottery winners were not happier than non-winners. And in the original sample, they studied people with spinal cord injuries, and they found that they were less happy. But I recently replicated the study, and I took a group of people with spinal cord injuries who had had their injuries for almost 20 years, and there was no difference between the lottery winners with spinal cord injury and control subjects. And further, even among the people who have the most severe level of spinal cord injury, again, people whose necks are broken so high that they require a ventilator to breathe, 84% report that their quality of life is average or above average. And in fact, there is beginning to be research showing that there could be some benefits to disabling injury. In one of my first research projects, I looked at young adults without spinal cord injuries and compared them to young adults who had acquired traumatic onset spinal cord injury, and found that the ones without spinal cord injuries were shown to have a bias for remembering negative stimuli, negative images. But when you took the people with spinal cord injuries, you didn't find this bias. And in fact, they were better able to regulate their emotions. And importantly, that shift was endured. I measured them again 8 years later, and found that my spinal cord injured subjects were better able to regulate their emotions. A final related shift that's affecting the disability dialogue within psychological science is a construct called post-traumatic growth, or PTG. And this is a transition from the sole focus on PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And PTG refers to positive changes resulting from the psychological struggle with difficult life events and adversity. And these changes can be behavioral, they can be cognitive, emotional, and they have been increasingly documented in populations of people with disabilities. And they generally occur, these benefits generally occur in three domains. First, people's perceptions of themselves can improve. They can come to see themselves as stronger, more resilient, and just having a greater self-knowledge. Second, there's enhanced relationships with others. Deepened intimacy and greater compassion and tolerance for others have been reported. And finally, changed priorities and deepened philosophies of life have been widely reported. And interestingly, unlike PTSD, which occurs in a small minority of people following traumatic life experiences, PTG, the prevalence ranges from sizable minorities like 30 to 40% to majorities like 60 to 80%. So, return to where we began. It's these sorts of more balanced, accurate, and inclusive conceptualizations of what disability can be that are needed to enter into the current dialogue of what disability is, and in transitioning from the medical model, which is founded solidly on the belief of inherently less worthy lives, to the social model, which is founded on the belief of social justice for all. What we are ultimately confronting is the mental process of stigma. And it's this process, this mindset, which is what needs to be changed the most now. With that framework, we'll be hearing from some students. First, Daniel Paris.
How's it going, everybody? All right, my name is Daniel Paris, and I am a person with ADHD and other documented learning disabilities. A very famous biblical character once said, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." Still, people make rash generalizations and judge others with little to no knowledge of their situations each and every day. Sometimes there is more to a situation than meets the eye, and it is these harsh judgments and lack of insight and empathy towards a young person by uninformed members of a community that create the kinds of self-fulfilling prophecies which become associated with students who have intellectual disabilities. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, California. One thing I learned early on growing up in the public school system was that I was nothing more than a standardized test score. From an early age, I was labeled with ADHD. I did not focus well, sit still for long periods of time, or test well. In the public school system, this made me a trouble child, and if I could not magically conform to the system in place, I was not worth the time to fix. Still, I received passing grades all the way from elementary school through middle school, so despite my inability to read and talk properly, to make social connections with my peers, to finish tests on time, and the many additional hours I needed to study to process basic concepts, my schools never once tested me for learning disabilities and decided to put all the blame on my ADHD, average intelligence, and perceived poor work ethic. As the school curriculum continued to become more rigorous, I found myself receiving lower grades each passing year and increasingly unable to compensate for my disabilities. By the 7th grade, I spent nearly half of every day in the school counselor's office because I was either acting out, sleeping, or having panic attacks in class. Again, the school deemed what was going on with me to be a behavioral issue and approached me with behavioral modification interventions to solve the problem. Now, since I was a good kid and still wanted to do well at that point, I took away certain lessons and spent more time actually inside the classroom in 8th grade. However, by high school, I could not handle the neglect anymore. My grades were slipping tremendously, and no one believed me when I said I was trying to study, trying to do the reading, and trying to do the homework. I had spent years at that point being isolated and made fun of for being stupid by my peers, and I had spent years being tossed out of class by angry and aggressive adult teachers who had no patience for me. And now, as my K-12 experience was coming to an end, I was hearing that college was not for everyone, especially people like me. You mix that with some teenage hormones, sizable family issues, and an outside world of bad influences, drugs, violence, especially in major urban cities such as Los Angeles, and it should come as no surprise when I tell you that my days in high school were soon over. By the end of 10th grade, I had become just another statistic. In 10th grade, I began ditching school nearly every day, using drugs and alcohol, and participating in gang activities. By the end of that year, I was failing every class and I was in constant trouble. I had a 1.1 GPA at the time I dropped out and was eventually banned from my campus. I remember a teacher over there who often kicked me out of class and on one occasion told me that they would bet me that I would not make it to my 21st birthday, but that I would not be alive to pay them, so I make the bet. After nearly 2 years of living homeless, sleeping at different friends' houses, passing out at random parties, and in my old 1989 Toyota Corolla, I found myself enrolling in an alternative education program so that I could get my GED. There I met dozens of students with very similar stories. Nearly everyone in these alternative programs had an IEP, individualized education plan, or some other obvious undocumented disability. The system in place had failed them all, but not because they were not capable. Why they failed was not because they were not put into remedial classes fast enough so that they could have an easier time. Why they failed was not because they could not take stimulants that put their minds in focus. They failed because they were not given the basic accommodations they needed from their schools to meet their specific learning disabilities. Not giving someone with a processing disorder extra time to take a test is like taking away ramps for someone who is using a wheelchair. Not providing a screen reader for someone with dyslexia or reading disorder is like not providing an interpreter for a student who is deaf. Too often, students with intellectual disabilities are not given what they need because people think they are lazy or unintelligent. Too often are students with intellectual disabilities overlooked for having something else wrong with them because their caregivers and school staff are uninformed. Too often are students with intellectual disabilities not evaluated because caregivers carry a social stigma that they do not want associated with their student. Too often are students with intellectual disabilities unwilling to take medications because they feel stupid for needing it or are afraid to be made fun of for needing it. Too often are students with intellectual disabilities given low expectations because it is easier for caregivers and school staff to deal with. Too often are students with intellectual disabilities screened out by charter schools so that they do not have to pay for their accommodations. Too often are students with intellectual disabilities disproportionately targeted for disciplinary actions despite being, quote, protected by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act on issues of discrimination. I am here today because I can attest to the civil rights violations that I have experienced firsthand, witnessed happen to my friends, and is currently happening to some of my students, relatives, and neighbors. And because I am proof that with the right kind of support system in place, students with intellectual disabilities can do anything they put their minds to. It is simply time for our society to be held accountable for the underachievement, disproportionate discipline, and in some cases deaths that current civil rights violations have caused students with intellectual disabilities.
Hi everyone. As some of you may know, my name is Mary Billington, and I'm also a master's student in the Education Policy and Management program here at the Ed School. I also happen to be legally blind and a 3-time cancer survivor. I was first diagnosed with cancer when I was 6 months old. At the time, I had malignant tumors in each of my eyes that left me with a severe visual impairment. I was then diagnosed again when I was 12 years old with bone cancer in my right sinus. And when I was 15, I underwent open heart surgery to remove a malignant mass from my heart. I am happy to report, though, that I'm now 24 years old and have been cancer-free for nearly 9 years. I thought a lot about what I might say to you all today, and I've decided to share a single anecdote. I think this story in particular highlights not only the stigmatization of disabled individuals, whether it be intentional or unintentional, as well as underscores our role and responsibility as leaders and educators to also function as facilitators of social justice. As an undergraduate, I attended a university whose education program prided itself on being a promoter of social justice education. In our lecture halls, we talked day in and day out about challenging norms, discussing differences, and encouraging social action in the context of our own classrooms. When I student taught, however, my experience was entirely different. I was placed in a second grade classroom on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and after spending a couple of days working with my cooperating teacher to prepare our classroom for our students' arrival, I decided it was finally time to self-identify my disability to her. Although I am legally blind, I am largely sighted on the spectrum of legal blindness, and my mobility and the fact that I don't use a white cane or a seeing eye dog or I don't read Braille, all of those things often make it difficult for others to understand the real severity of my visual impairment. Although if any of you have had the luxury of sitting behind me in class and having a look at the size of the text on my computer screen, you know that it's true. So I had this discussion with my cooperating teacher, and that was all fine and good. And then I asked her about how we might discuss this issue with our students. I thought for both practical and philosophical purposes, it was a really important conversation to have. Her immediate response was that she would have to run this by her principal, that she didn't know what the protocol would be for this type of thing. And then about a week later, several days into the school year, once our kids had been running around for several days, she came to me and explained that she and the principal would prefer if I didn't discuss my disability with the students, that if any of them had a particular question, I was of course to answer it, but beyond that, they saw no reason for me to discuss my disability with them. This was difficult for me to hear for two specific reasons. First, as I mentioned, there is a practical limitation at play here. I was going to operate differently than perfectly sighted teachers would in the classroom. I was going to have to do things differently. And I would have been more comfortable, and I think my students would have had a better understanding if they had a context as to why that was taking place. Why was Mary standing closer to the board? Why did she ask me to read my story out loud to her? Things like that, I think, would have been a lot easier for them to understand and process had they had the knowledge that, in fact, I was different. Also, not addressing this topic, I think, was teaching our students the entirely wrong lesson. I can't say that my students immediately had a clear understanding of the severity of my disability. As I explained, most people don't. But I wear an eye patch. That's not lost on 7-year-olds. At all. And so they knew something was different about me. And many of them had legitimate questions about that. But by ignoring the issue, we were demonstrating to them that talking about difference and talking about disability is inherently bad. It's not. I would have much preferred, as a teacher, as a person with a disability, as a member of our society, to have developed a space in which my students wouldn't have learned not to ask questions at all, but could have had the opportunity to learn how to ask those questions that communicated their concern, their care, their genuine curiosity, but also made me feel comfortable as the recipient of those questions. I think a conversation like that could have led to a larger conversation about differences in our classroom community and how we all come to the classroom with a different set of characteristics, and together we can collaborate to be a successful team. Largely, I was not allowed that opportunity to have that teaching moment, but I guarantee you I snuck it in from time to time. I present this anecdote to you, this situation, not to berate the actions of my cooperating teacher. I don't believe she is a malicious person. I know she's not a bad teacher. She simply was unfamiliar with the topic of disability, and the idea of facilitating such a conversation or allowing me to do so made her uncomfortable. In that discomfort, however, she didn't take the time to carefully consider the ramifications of her choice not to discuss the issue. So, as educators and as leaders, I advise you to be conscientious, to think about the choices that you make and the decisions that you make. Talking about disability and talking about difference is not always bad. And oftentimes, ignoring it entirely is worse. So be deliberate, be cognizant of your actions, continue this conversation, allow it to be positive, and be promoters of social justice. Thank
you. Hi, I'm Kevin Mintz. I am a candidate for a bachelor's in government at Harvard College and hope to be teaching in the Boston public schools next year. Since Shen so eloquently started this presentation by talking about the medical model, I wanted to begin by relaying an anecdote my parents have told me about when I was 9 months old. I had obviously been missing some of the developmental milestones that are typical for young babies. For example, I think I could not walk was the main thing that scared them. And so they took me to see a neurologist who ordered a myriad of tests. And after he ran all of them, he sat down with my parents and in a very cold, impersonal tone told them I would never be normal. As my parents and I like to laugh about now, I am anything but normal. But our conception of anything but normal is obviously much more positive than what that horrible neurologist was talking about. And the point of this presentation is to highlight that disability is a social justice issue, and the best way I can contribute to that discussion is telling you that without the support of courageous, wonderful, caring people, beginning with my parents and continuing on to everybody here at Huggy, that neurologist prediction might very well come true. I could not talk till the age of 3, and it took 8 years of private therapy with a woman who literally had me singing Broadway show tunes and writing short stories using my voice and her hands as a transcriber to get me there. That being said, people can also be the negative forces in precluding me from being able to live my daily life, especially in the context of education. My father had to be my personal care attendant for 5 years, from 8th to 12th grade, because the school system could not find someone who could take me to the bathroom and transcribe advanced mathematics and science. that was wonderful. Not because that should be the norm, but because my school district, seeing no other options, ultimately allowed what was best for me. The negative aspect of that, of course, came from my adolescent fears. The best way to summarize this is to tell you that I graduated valedictorian of my high school class. But honestly, until I got into Harvard, everyone thought the only reason I was at the top of the class was because my father was doing all of my work for me. Many of you in this room have become my colleagues and know that no one does my work except me. And as if this wasn't bad enough, I get to the few months prior to graduation. I'm from Florida, and all of the high school seniors get to go to Disney World for their graduation. I think I was literally the first person to buy a ticket because I'm a Disney junkie. Yet, a week before the trip, my assistant principal informed me and my parents that although I was valedictorian, the school had failed to secure a wheelchair accessible bus, and therefore I would not be allowed to go. Now, my mother hit the roof and called the special ed director of Miami-Dade County, who had gotten to know us over 14 years. He's a friend of mine, actually, and naturally the situation was resolved in an instant. But my point is, it shouldn't take a phone call from the district office to secure kids in wheelchairs accessible. buses. Similarly, academic accommodations should be given to students, not because a school has to provide them, but solely because it's the right thing to do. And I hope that is the lesson you take away from this presentation. Anytime.
We have some time for questions, if anybody would like to.
Okay, yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think more overt, more obvious disabilities are like things that you can see every day, like wheelchairs and people who are blind with a walking cane, and something that people just don't think about, I guess, as much when they think of disability at times are psychiatric disorders and other learning disabilities. So that's why I use the term intellectual disabilities, just to specify. My, my personal story, when I went into an alternative program, that's kind of where I left off. I spent about 3 years taking about a class a semester or during the summer, going to a local community college. When I got into the alternative program, that's when they finally tested me for learning disabilities, and noticed they gave me a couple NOS diagnoses along with a reading disorder and a generalized processing disorder. And I spent a few years in the junior college system taking remedial classes and spending a lot of time. But once I got the medication that I needed and the accommodations that I needed, and spent a lot of time making up for the lack of education that I had had up until that point, the school that I got into for my undergraduate institution was the University of Southern California, and they're a private institution. The moment I got there, the moment I arrived on campus, they sat me down with support counselors for academic purposes and for just college transition purposes. And I spent Monday through Friday, unlike all my friends who got to go like basically after class and party and have fun, I spent about 16 hours a day on average, Monday through Friday, on campus in a little room that was in the disability center, and just studied, met with all my professors in their office hours, did anything I needed to do to get the grades, and my grades just progressed, more so than I could have ever imagined that they would have. Psychology.
I'll answer that one. On a practical level, as a person in a wheelchair, I would like to see most buildings, regardless of when they were originally constructed, to be wheelchair accessible. I think that's a somewhat obvious observation to make, but you'd be surprised how many buildings are still not accessible. More broadly, I would hope to see a lot of the media conception of disability become more positive, or at least neutral. To quote one of my mentors, shows like Lee on television are getting there, but I think there are things in popular culture that still add to negative stereotypes, and honestly, you can make all the laws in the world. You can tell people what they need to do, but until you change a buddy's attitude, you're not going to get anywhere.
Back on that, I think Kevin's exactly right that there are particular areas where we need to make significant progress, but also from the societal perspective, I think one of the things we have to look forward to is inclusive education is a relatively new, or inclusive education done well is still very rare, right? But we're moving in the right direction in that perspective. So there's a lot more integration of disabled students in general education classrooms, and a lot more interaction between disabled young people and non-disabled young people. And I think that'll be a great catalyst for change in the future in terms of societal perspectives. Yes, I think the media addressing it, being progressive in that area and being very on point about it and direct about it will be certainly helpful. But I think there's also, we're on the verge of something great, I think, if we get it right in our classrooms at a young age. I think we can accomplish a lot in terms of shaping who our citizenry is and how they respond to disability and how they conceptualize disability. Yes, and I think, it's hard to know how to answer that question, because I think a lot has also, for me personally, a lot about myself has changed over the years and how I address these issues and what kind of self-advocacy I enact. But I think in general, it's certainly not perfect, but the Ed School has been a great environment for me and has been very accommodating and receptive to my needs, and that may be partly a product of just a bunch of educators who, in the same place. I think we're a different subset of the population. We're not perfect, but we may be more attuned to these issues than the general population, or I would hope that we are. There's definitely room for improvement, but I think it's this has been the most successful attempt at that I've ever experienced. Anybody
I'm
else?
not an ed school student. Answer to the question, is it different here? I'll give an emphatic yes. And that's part of the reason why I try to spend as much of my time at the ed school as possible. When I first met Eileen, who is the guru of everything accessible in the ed school, she came straight up to me. I was taking a statistics class in the ed school, and she came straight up to me and shook my hand and told me to be in touch with her if I needed anything. And it was the first time since I'd arrived at Harvard 3 years prior where I'd had anybody express a positive desire to know me because of my disability, as opposed to thinking of me as a liability or something that was going to have to be accommodated, something extra. And including both professors and the people who worked on access across GSAS. And then in terms of the student body as well as the other faculty, what I've noticed is that there's a discernible difference in terms of the way people approach me. People say hello, they speak to me by looking in my eyes, they offer to help, they're not afraid to use the word wheelchair, which is sort of like the W word. And I think a lot of it has to do with two things. Probably one has to do with the age difference. People in the ed school are generally older than people who come straight out of undergraduate in my program. And also I think the life orientation towards wanting to serve others and make a difference and help people, I think that really shows up in the way people interact with people who have differences. Thank you so much to everyone.